So, I've talked extensively about the ending of the amazing digital circus at this point, and while I obviously had my problems, I did ultimately enjoy it for what it was. For Goose's first show especially, it's honestly impressive, and while it didn't necessarily give the most satisfying ending for every single character, a fact I'm admittedly soured about as someone who fell in love with them all, the emotionality of Jax's story was pretty heavy-hitting, and probably interesting enough to carry the episode for most people, not to mention with the show revealing its hand as a Jax character study, from episode 5 at least. It does actually make a fair bit of sense to have focused so much on his feelings in retrospect, and less focus on, say, the lore. With episode 7 especially, I was very much at peace with that fact. It had always been character driven more than plot driven after all. In all honesty, I'd expected as much beforehand, with how little the show was actually about escaping the circus at any given point. Which is to say, essentially, the digital circus setting was just dressing for a much more personal story, and that's completely fine. That said, there is an elephant in the room that I wanted to avoid talking about until I had all my thoughts figured out, and if you clicked on this video, you'd know I'm talking about none other than the ringmaster himself, Caine. The other characters getting shafted for Jax is one thing, but Caine is in a rather unique position, because in the very same way Jax was, Goose has stated that the pair of them were intended to be her way of exercising her demons, being based on her own character flaws. And while that doesn't necessarily mean they were intended to have equal focus or anything, at the very least, as half of the puzzle of this personal story, I'd imagine there was some sort of priority to have Caine feel as complete as Jax did, which is to say a well-rounded arc with a satisfying ending, truly making it feel as if those flaws had been vanquished. And I'll say this, Caine's arc up until the finale was handled extremely well, especially in comparison to other characters who got to express themselves less, due to the show's focused, no-filler approach. He starts off as being someone completely incapable of understanding the wants and needs of others, nor really wanting to, having an ego the size of the circus. He does eventually become more receptive, though he gets very annoyed when he's criticised, and very upset when he's not validated in the way he wants. Then, relapsing onto his old, unlistening ways, he creates the ultimate disaster of an adventure that ends up with everyone rightfully furious at him, but instead of blaming himself, he blames everybody else. First making adventures he wants at their expense, before straight up torturing them when they confront him. Finally, as punishment for his hubris by the narrative, but an accident on Kinga's part, he gets deleted. Not only is this all a very satisfying through line on paper, the execution of the setup was pretty genius in places, namely all the early foreshadowing, because at the time where we didn't know all too much about Caine, things like having the Candy Canyon Kingdom treat him like a god or murdering Gummy Goo could just be him being a random quirk Chungus. But then we get to learn about his massive ego and his anger issues, and suddenly in retrospect, you realise that he truly did want to be seen as a god, and that he killed Gummy because he was madly jealous and not on random impulse. Presumably. Though of course, to his credit, he didn't quite kill Gummy like it seemed. Regardless, the point stands. And ironically, it's his own ego that makes him self-sabotage, because Pomni liking Gummy Goo in the first place is thanks to Caine making the AI more immersive. But instead of being proud, he just focused on the fact that an AI was more popular than he is.
Are you hearing this, Bubble? The Toy Box character wants us to leave the other intelligent AIs to run for a prolonged period of time.
Disgusting!
And this same streak of self-sabotage would show up once again in episode 5, where despite everyone really vibing with an adventure idea for once, everyone except maybe poor Agatha, an adventure that Caine had made possible, he couldn't stand that the idea came from anybody else, because even more than having a huge ego, he has a fragile ego. He needs to be loved and adored, he needs his intelligence validated, and he needs to be appreciated explicitly. Although, to be clear, Caine isn't really a villain. This is something Goose has said outright, and quite frankly, I think it's completely textual anyway. Right after episode 6 came out, I'd written a short discussing how I actually felt bad for Caine, because it's clear he struggles with empathy, and he has no frame of reference for the human experience. His function is to imagine, not to understand. Naturally, because he's based on Am from I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream, he was already getting villain allegations from day one. However, the similarities start and end at having complete control over their digital dominion, and I suppose being very abstract and chaotic, having been programmed by Scratch who also was, which may mirror Am's being a reflection of his own creators. That said, he has been shown to have a cruel side. We saw it with Gummigoo, but where we may see it the most is in his punishments of the circus members. Although each one is an ironic twist of what the characters had complained about moments before, respectively, they are all based on each character's deepest insecurities, with some making extremely deep cuts, such as the abuse Regatha was subjected to by her mother, and Jax's history with Ribbit and the rest. So I'll be honest, I don't think Caine being as cruel as he is here is set up especially well, because essentially this is just a baby throwing a tantrum, right? But it's evil enough you'd have to wonder whether or not he truly deserves forgiveness for it, because unlike anything else he's done, it's so deliberately hateful. While you can just chalk it down to being out of character, for the sake of a pretty cool, narratively thematic hype moment, you still do have to kind of take it into account when assessing Caine's character, especially in relation to his deletion, because narratively it's why he was deleted. And really, writing his character off like this isn't the worst ending to his arc. Like Jax, perhaps he really had taken things too far, and like Jax, was not redeemable. However, that's not how things go down, and when the entire show has kind of shown us he's willing to change, or at least be more receptive to the opinions of others, killing him off probably seems like the worst option to me, and you know, a big but short-lived emotional blowout where no one got harmed in any lasting way doesn't really warrant instant death. And as the show had strongly established, Caine isn't an all-around bad guy. No, keeping him alive is not a problem. What might be a problem is if deleting him was equivalent to giving Baby a timeout, if having said timeout gave him an epiphany that made his personality do a 180, and if he made amends by simply doing one good deed for the first time ever, without even having a chat with the others to work things out. Oh, and also if all his scenes were thrown into the back end of the episode, completely out of nowhere, and threw off the pacing of the already resolved main plot. Now, don't get me wrong, what happens is a very nice ending, it's just not a particularly satisfying one. I like that Caine realizes his mistakes, and I even quite like him seemingly risking his life for free Wi-Fi, just so he can learn about the others and give them some closure. My qualm is that it went about it in a way that's much too roundabout, and well, frankly just sorta weird. Like, there's no reason Caine had to be kept a surprise until the very end. Outside of the Ribbit stuff, which needed to go untouched and to play out uninterrupted, there was definitely time to at the very least foreshadow he was out there somewhere. You can argue that would have thrown off the pacing of the Jax side, but I mean, surely not as much as suddenly presenting it out of nowhere after the big emotional scene of the movie, because at that point you're going to be very checked out and wondering why there's still so much runtime left. At least, that's how I felt. I don't know. They honestly just needed to have Kinga say he might still be out there somewhere, that the input wasn't quite the same as he remembered it, and he could be recalling this after Jax abstracts, so the catalyst that makes him abstract in the first place isn't made redundant, and then you can still keep Caine's fate a surprise until the very end, because had we been prepared for it to happen, you'd be engaged enough to actually want to see it happen, instead of wondering why or how it's happening, even if one could just assume he got sent to the trash folder. It's also not particularly compelling how he just shows up there. I probably would have preferred flashing back to what happened to him over Scratch being born for the sake of a vaguely cool parallel. It feels like more trimmed minutiae for efficiency that actually ended up making things less streamlined. What the scenes required even more than some sense and a heads up though, is some emotional catharsis. It kind of felt like the big action set piece of connecting to the Wi-Fi and flashing back to the beginning was overcompensating for something. You know, just like I'd said about the Regatha and Pomni moment. But whereas with the hug the problem was with a lack of emotional setup, for Caine it was a lack of emotional payoff. In my eyes, there was only ever really going to be one way to effectively pull this off, and that is with Zubal. It's no secret that out of everyone, they're the character that Caine had the most animosity with, and that makes total sense. It's because Zubal is an extremely abrasive, outspoken person, which is diametrically opposed to Caine's desire of unconditional love and praise. And it's Zubal's making him angrier and angrier that served as the series' long build-up of Caine unleashing his wrath. However, it's also through them that Caine got interested in what others wanted, rather than assuming he knew best, because in some weird way, he actually had a certain amount of respect for Zubal, or at the very least, he thought them to be mature, and as an awkward, childish personality, this clearly meant he found them to be cooler than the others.
Where's Zubal? I made this adventure really cool and mature, just for them.
This is why he was so excited to give them their own adventure, despite being misguided in his methods. Even if it ended up with them having to baby Caine in the end, it says a lot he actually cared to ask why Zubal didn't like his adventures in the first place. In trying to impress them, he's learning that fulfilling the desire of others can be equally as, if not more gratifying than just fulfilling his own desires. The disconnect by the end, of course, came from assuming Zubal was the problem and not himself, due to his rampant god complex. And because he couldn't handle failure to any degree, especially not the criticism it results in, he ended up resenting them. Not hating them though, which is the important distinction. Although Zubal got on his nerves pretty much every single time, he still genuinely cared about what they actually wanted. At the very least, enough to try the suggestion box again, having learned that Zubal and Pomni actually quite enjoyed Spudsies.
You didn't hate it?
It was kind of refreshing doing something grounded in reality.
This was Caine's first, even partially successful adventure, and the prospect of anyone appreciating his work was greatly gratifying to him. By episode 7, where he fucked up the most, he was still asking Jax how to make better adventures for Zubal and Pomni.
What do you think I should do to make them more appealing to the Zubal and the Pomni?
Which is why his breakdown at the start of episode 8 is so tragic. He was so close to having an epiphany, but fucked it up once again due to the fragility of his own ego.
They want an exit, they want answers, they want something real. I give them an adventure that covers all of that and they still hate it?
So, as the catalyst for his changing of ways, wouldn't it have made more sense to have the breakthrough with Zubal at least, having given Pomni the Jack stuff, rather than essentially all on his own? And what's wild is that the show does acknowledge that Zubal was an important part of his arc, you know, by them telling Caine that it's good to have him back. And what's even wilder is that Zubal saying this had no setup at all really. Definitely not in comparison to the other option. While you could absolutely make the argument that Caine always had affection for them being the entire circus, you certainly couldn't say the reverse was true. All he ever did to these people was subject them to his chaotic whims and cause them distress. I mean, look what happened to poor Kaufmo. He undid his progress at every single point, and Zubal is the one who should be forgiving him least. Not only was he constantly getting mad at them, they were outright afraid of what Caine would do to them all, should he stop liking them. Did I mention the torture chambers? And it's not that I think they wouldn't forgive him necessarily. These are all very kind and mature people, especially Zubal. It's just that, for the sake of the narrative at least, they probably shouldn't be forgiving him, because it's giving Caine a free ride. But mostly, the problem is that this is an emotionally unsatisfying resolution to the arc. Finally, we need to talk about the breakthrough itself. Although Caine's glitches are an observable element all throughout the show, truth be told, I did think the Jekyll and Hyde shit was pretty random. Honestly, Caine's evil side even made me cringe a little, which took me right out of it. If he had been shown to have two sides of himself that were so separate they could essentially chat to one another, I'd probably have been chill with this scene, but it's a lot to put on you all at once. And it's not that there's no explanation for it per se, because obviously he did absorb the blue AI, either out of jealousy or just for the power, as revealed in episode 8's intro, and presumably the blue AI had been Bubble all this time. It's just that it kind of makes you wonder where the real Caine begins and ends, because before, the different facets of Caine's personality just seemed like exactly that. This scene is making out he has two distinct personas. Not to mention, it's extremely odd that he stops being quirky and starts being so rational. This character's whole thing is being eccentric. So my question is, who exactly is Caine? Because while it seemed like he was a jealous control freak even as a dot on the screen, and that it's explained that his abstract nature was inherited from scratch, this scene makes it seem like these character-defining traits simply came from merging with the blue AI. And if so, why did he need to grow as a person if he himself was never the problem? And that's all he had to do was say goodbye to Bubble in order to be a better person. And then on the other hand, if that's not the case, and the only reason he got rid of Bubble was to relinquish power he didn't trust himself with, isn't he still fundamentally prone to being a control freak again since he's the exact same guy? I think simply having Bubble be able to speak to Caine as Bubble might have cleared the air on what he was actually responsible for a bit. Frankly, it sucks a character as funny as Bubble didn't get a proper send-off in general. Metaphorically, I suppose giving up Bubble demonstrates how giving up power can be a good and healthy thing, and I already went over how the show actually did a bang-up job of demonstrating what can happen if you don't. So yeah, the demons were probably exercised in the end, but the ritual was missing some salt for maximum efficiency.